It was a moment the world wasn't expecting. A moment that, if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed in the flurry of headlines, social media chatter, and royal press releases. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, known to millions as poised, controlled, and always in command of her public image, was in tears. Not a casual, fleeting tear on a red carpet. Not a photo op faux emotion captured at the perfect angle, but real, raw tears. And they weren't just tears of frustration or exhaustion or the result of another invasive paparazzi moment. They were tears sparked by something far more personal, far more intimate. They were tears caused by words. Words spoken by the man she married, the man she trusted above all others, and the man who had just publicly drawn a line she wasn't sure she could cross. Prince Harry. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine, for a moment, what it must feel like to have the person you thought was your strongest ally, your partner in every sense of the word, publicly accuse you. Not angrily, not with a loud confrontation, but with the calm, measured force of someone who has lived trauma and survived it, of behaviors that could destroy you. Imagine the layers of betrayal, fear, and confusion pressing down, and imagine that all of this is happening while the cameras are watching, the world is judging, and the legacy of someone you both loved dearly hangs in the balance. This was Meghan's reality in that tense, unforgettable moment. The words Harry spoke weren't just for Meghan. They were for the world. They were a reminder, a warning, and a declaration. I lost one woman to the cameras. I won't lose myself to them again. Just 16 words. But the weight behind them was immeasurable. Those words carried the memory of his mother, Princess Diana, whose life was relentlessly consumed by the very cameras that now scrutinized his every move. Those words carried the pain of a childhood watched through lenses, the heartache of growing up in a world that had commodified tragedy, and the steely resolve of a man who would not allow history to repeat itself. They were words that drew a harsh line between what was acceptable and what was not. And for Meghan, they landed like a blow she hadn't expected. You might be asking yourself, why now? Why bring this up at a time when, on the surface, Meghan and Harry seem to have constructed a life of autonomy, wealth, and influence? Why focus on private tensions spilling into the public arena? The answer is simple, but chilling. Because what Harry said, and how Meghan reacted, exposes something far deeper than celebrity drama. It exposes the collision of personal trauma with public image, of intimate betrayal with media spectacle, and of legacy with personal ambition. And understanding it isn't just about knowing who said what. It's about seeing the human cost of living in a world where every move is judged, dissected, and amplified 1,000-fold. Let's go back a step. Harry has always been protective of his mother's memory. Every interview, every public statement, every pause and gesture carries the invisible weight of her absence. Diana's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a lesson, harsh and unforgiving, about the dangers of fame, media obsession, and public exposure. Harry's vow to himself, repeated silently countless times over the years, has always been clear: never again. Never let the cameras control him. Never let his life be used as fodder for headlines. Never allow history to claim another victim in his family. And then came Meghan. Meghan, who had built her own public persona as a woman of poise, confidence, and media savvy, but who also had ambitions, desires, and an understanding of how public attention could be used strategically. Some saw it as confidence. Some saw it as ambition. Some, particularly Harry, saw it as dangerous, because he had seen firsthand what obsession with the lens could do. He had seen what it had done to his mother. And now, here was someone he loved, someone he trusted, stepping into that very world, perhaps unknowingly tempting fate. It's not that Harry doubted Meghan's love for him. Far from it. It's that he doubted the consequences of living so openly under a microscope. He knew, more than anyone, the price of public attention. He knew the lure of headlines could be intoxicating, seductive even. He knew the damage it could do, the exposure it demanded, the way it forced you to live a life measured in sound bites, not moments. And so, his words were firm, almost surgical in their delivery. There was no need to yell, no need to dramatize. Every syllable carried the weight of experience, of pain, of forewarning. And that is what cut Meghan so deeply. Now, Don't misunderstand. Meghan is no stranger to pressure. She has faced scrutiny since before her relationship with Harry even became public. She has built a career navigating complex media landscapes, handling criticism with strategic precision. But even the most seasoned can falter when confronted with the raw, unfiltered weight of someone else's trauma. The trauma of the person you promised to share a life with. Her tears were not weakness. They were the human reaction to being confronted by the past in a way that was impossible to ignore. They were the reaction to a moment in which history, grief, and love collided violently in front of the world. And yet, there's another layer to this story. Because it wasn't just Harry's words that caused Meghan's tears, it was what they implied. His statement implied limits, boundaries, and consequences. It implied that history was watching, that Diana's memory demanded respect, and that any misstep could have profound emotional consequences. It implied that the cameras, the public, the legacy of tragedy, and personal betrayal were all intertwined. Meghan, brilliant and strategic though she may be, realized in that instant that navigating this world meant more than optics. It meant understanding stakes that could touch life and death. That's not hyperbole. That's the gravity of the moment. And it's what makes this story so compelling. We also have to consider the human psychology of the moment. Imagine being told, subtly but unmistakably, that your actions, your carefully constructed public image, your attempts to control perception, your very presence, could have consequences you hadn't fully anticipated. It's a psychological jolt, a moment of shock that forces instant reflection. Meghan's mind, no doubt, raced through every interview, every appearance, every calculated smile, and wondered if she had unknowingly crossed an invisible line. And as tears fell, the audience could feel the tension, even through screens, headlines, and second-hand accounts. But here's where the intrigue deepens. The world only saw a woman in tears. They saw a headline, a social media post, a fleeting image. They didn't see the private discussions, the conversations with aides, the arguments, or the whispered warnings. They didn't see the pressure cooker of family, legacy, and media scrutiny that created this explosive moment. And that's exactly what makes this story so irresistible. There's a truth beneath the surface, one that the public rarely accesses, a truth filled with strategy, emotion, fear, and the weight of history. It's a truth that forces us to ask, what drives a person to tears when no one is screaming? What drives a public figure to bend, to falter, when confronted with the lived trauma of someone they love? Now, some critics may argue that this is just celebrity drama. They might say that tears and statements are merely fuel for tabloid consumption. But anyone who has followed Harry's life knows better. Anyone who remembers the relentless attention Diana endured knows better. This isn't just drama. This is an insight into human behavior under extraordinary pressure, into love tested by legacy, into the collision of private grief and public performance. And understanding this, fully and in detail, is what sets this story apart. So, why does this story matter now? Why revisit a moment that some may have skimmed over in passing news cycles? Because beneath the tears, beneath the public statements, lies a larger narrative about trust, legacy, and the human cost of fame. Because Harry's words were more than a statement. They were a warning, a boundary, and a declaration that the mistakes of the past cannot be repeated. Because Meghan's tears were more than a reaction. They were the start of a moment that would have consequences, both personal and public, that few could anticipate. And so, as we dive into the full story, there's one question that must guide us. How does someone navigate love, ambition, and legacy when every move is scrutinized, when every word could be twisted, and when history itself demands caution? How does one reconcile personal desire with inherited trauma? And most importantly, what happens when the very person you trust to protect you becomes the messenger of a truth so hard it could break you? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What exactly did Harry say that could send Meghan to tears? And why did the world feel the weight of those words the moment they left his lips? It was one of those statements that seemed simple, almost deceptively so, yet carried a gravity that could shake even the most composed individuals. I lost one woman to the cameras. I won't lose myself to them again. 16 words. Short, precise, direct. But each one was loaded with history, with grief, with a warning that resonated far beyond the moment. Think about that for a second. Imagine living with the knowledge that one wrong glance at a camera, one slip of behavior, could result in tragedy. Now imagine watching your partner, the person you trust to share a life with, stepping closer to that line, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps carelessly. That is the context in which these words landed. They were not just a reminder. They were a boundary, a line Harry would not allow to be crossed. From the outside, it looked like a controlled, calculated statement. The public, used to his calm demeanor and measured words, might not have realized how much emotion lay beneath the surface. But those closest to Harry knew. They knew that every pause, every emphasis, every syllable was deliberate, informed by decades of pain and observation. Harry's life had been shaped by tragedy, and he carried the memory of his mother's death like a weight that never lightened. It wasn't just grief, it was a warning written into the very fabric of his existence. The cameras, the press, the media, they were more than observers. They were predators. And Harry, having survived that environment for decades, had learned to recognize the subtle signals, the early signs, the traps that were set long before they could even be recognized as danger. He had lived under scrutiny that turned private life into public entertainment. And now, as he spoke, he made sure Meghan understood the stakes. She wasn't just reacting to a statement. She was reacting to history itself speaking through the voice of the man she loved. And here's the kicker. Meghan, intelligent, media-savvy, and strategic though she was, hadn't fully anticipated the emotional weight behind those words. She had faced scrutiny before. She had managed public perception with the deftness of a seasoned professional. She understood optics. She understood headlines. But this was different. This was not a moment where spin could protect her. This was not a moment where charisma or poise could shield her from the gravity of lived experience. This was Harry, drawing a boundary not just for himself, but for the memory of a life that had been lost, for the lessons painfully learned, and for the promise that history would not repeat itself under his watch. Now, let's pause and consider the contradiction at play here. Harry was a man who wanted privacy, yet lived a life constantly under the spotlight. Meghan was a woman who had navigated public life with confidence, yet faced the same pressures Harry had spent his life avoiding. Their worlds collided in a very specific, very explosive way. One sought protection from the cameras. The other had built her identity around managing their gaze. It's almost ironic, isn't it? The person meant to be his partner in life, in love, and in shared experience, suddenly became the embodiment of the very forces he had spent a lifetime resisting. But the statement itself wasn't just a warning to Meghan. It was a public declaration. Think about that. A man standing in front of the world, choosing words that were meant to be heard by millions, not just by the woman he loved. Why would he do that? Was it a strategic move to set boundaries publicly? Was it a subtle message to the media that he was not to be manipulated, not to be consumed, not to be repeated like a cautionary tale? Or was it something more personal, a cry for understanding, a demand for respect, a need for Meghan to fully grasp the consequences of their unique, scrutinized lives? And there lies another twist, one that most people didn't notice. Harry's calm, almost detached delivery was intentionally emotional. It was meant to convey a seriousness that could not be ignored, a lesson delivered not through anger, but through clarity. He knew Meghan understood the cameras, the public attention, the potential for fame and PR. What he needed to communicate was not just the danger of overexposure. It was the emotional toll it could take, the cost it exacted, the way it could infiltrate every corner of life and slowly erode the foundations of trust, love, and safety. At this point, some of you might be asking, why did this cause such a visceral reaction in Meghan? Was it because Harry was controlling? Was it because she felt publicly humiliated? Or was it something deeper, something that tapped into the raw, unfiltered fear of losing a loved one? Not to an enemy, not to betrayal, but to a system of relentless scrutiny that had claimed his mother? The answer is all of the above, and yet it is none of them entirely. It was about the intersection of love, fear, and history, about the collision of two lives living in extraordinary circumstances. It was about a woman realizing, in that exact moment, that the line Harry had drawn was immovable, and that stepping too close could have consequences that went far beyond headlines. And let's not forget the public element. The world had already begun to speculate. Social media, news outlets, and tabloids were already parsing every word, every inflection, every pause. Some called it a warning. Others called it a confrontation. Many missed the emotional undercurrent entirely. But the tension was palpable. And as Meghan absorbed the weight of Harry's words, she couldn't help but feel exposed, both emotionally and strategically. This wasn't about spin. This wasn't about optics. This was about the raw, unfiltered power of history, memory, and love converging in a single, unforgettable moment. Yet even as Meghan wept, even as the world watched in speculation, there remained a layer most people overlooked. Harry's declaration was not just a reaction, it was preemptive. It was protection. He knew what the cameras could do. He knew what public attention could extract. He knew the vulnerabilities Meghan might unknowingly expose. And so he spoke, not out of anger, but out of foresight, out of the desire to protect both himself and the woman he loved from the same mistakes that had cost him so much before. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Because Meghan, for all her intelligence and experience, had her own perspective. She had ambitions, desires, and a deep understanding of public image. She had built a life navigating scrutiny and attention. And yet, in that moment, she realized that even her skill could not fully shield her from the emotional force of Harry's words. She was not just reacting to what was said, she was reacting to the reality it represented, to the weight of history and expectation pressing down in a way no PR strategy could counteract. The audience, now fully engaged, might wonder, did this moment define their relationship? Did it create a permanent fracture, or was it a turning point toward understanding? Did Meghan see it as a warning, a critique, or something more personal? And more importantly, how did this private confrontation become a story that the public would never forget, that would ripple through media outlets, social channels, and royal commentary for months to come? As the minutes passed, the tension did not ease. The cameras continued to flash. Reporters waited. Publicists prepared statements. And Meghan, caught in the storm of emotion and realization, understood that this was more than a moment of private grief. It was a moment that would be dissected, analyzed, and remembered. A moment where history, legacy, and personal boundaries collided so violently that it left an indelible mark on everyone involved. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it truly mean to cry when the world is watching? To weep when every tear might be captured, replayed, dissected, and weaponized? For Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, the answer is both simple and terrifying. It means vulnerability becomes public property. It means private pain becomes fodder for speculation. And it means that even the strongest armor, confidence, poise, control, can feel like a thin, fragile veneer when confronted with the weight of personal history and the judgment of millions. The first thing to understand is that Meghan has always been aware of the spotlight. She lived under scrutiny long before marrying Harry. From her early acting career to her charitable work and eventual rise as a global figure, she learned quickly how to navigate media attention. She mastered the delicate art of public persona, confident, charming, articulate, always in control. But control, as anyone who has been under pressure knows, can be an illusion. It can crack under stress, especially when the stress is emotional and deeply personal. And that is exactly what happened that day. Harry's words were a catalyst. They struck a nerve that Meghan hadn't anticipated. They reminded her that even in love, there are boundaries she cannot cross, lines drawn not by her, but by history, trauma, and lived experience. They reminded her that the stakes are higher than any headline, any award, any public approval. And suddenly, the calculated composure that had defined her public life was shattered. She was forced to confront herself not as a duchess, a celebrity, or a public figure, but as a woman grappling with the emotional weight of a partner's trauma and the legacy of a mother-in-law whose life ended tragically under public scrutiny. Imagine the inner turmoil. Meghan, accustomed to crafting narratives, to shaping perception, now faced a narrative she couldn't control. Every expression, every sigh, every blink could be interpreted. And yet, in that private moment, the cameras, while present in some form, felt almost secondary. The tears weren't for the public. They were for the human experience she was living, the collision of love, fear, and responsibility. But even private emotions in their world rarely stay private. Meghan knew that. She felt it. And it only added to the emotional intensity of the moment. The scene behind closed doors was intense. Meghan's aides, loyal but also pragmatic, tried to offer guidance and comfort. But their words, no matter how soothing, could not compete with the emotional gravity of Harry's statement. His words echoed in the room. I lost one woman to the cameras. I won't lose myself to them again. The weight of that memory, the reference to Diana, the reminder of what was at stake, hung over Meghan like a storm cloud. And unlike public appearances where strategy can mask fear, here there was no script, no teleprompter, no pre-prepared soundbite. The moment was raw, authentic, unscripted. It's important to note the psychological duality Meghan faced. On one hand, she had her instincts as a public figure, trained to manage, respond, and maintain composure. On the other, she had her instincts as a human being, facing a moment of profound emotional intensity. The conflict between these two selves, public and private, persona and person, was almost unbearable. She wanted to show strength. She wanted to project calm. She wanted to maintain control. And yet, tears came anyway. Because some moments, some emotions, cannot be contained. Interestingly, this reaction exposed a contradiction in public perception. Many outsiders might see Meghan's tears as weakness, as an overreaction, or as proof of fragility. But anyone who has experienced genuine emotional shock knows that tears are not weakness. They are a release, a signal, a way for the mind and body to process extreme stress. In fact, her tears were a testament to the depth of her understanding of Harry's world, the gravity of the media attention, and the complexity of the moment she was living. And yet, there's another layer. These were tears not only of fear, but of understanding, of realization. Meghan understood the weight of Harry's protective instincts. She understood the legacy he carried and the invisible lines drawn by history. She realized, in a way that perhaps she hadn't before, that their lives were not just theirs to navigate. They were entwined with the memories of tragedy, with the eyes of the public, and with expectations that were impossible to fully meet. This duality, between private vulnerability and public persona, is a defining feature of Meghan's life. It explains so much about the tension between her and Harry, about the scrutiny she faced from the media, and about the complex reactions of the royal family. Because Meghan's tears were not just personal, they were emblematic of a larger truth. They revealed the tension between what one wants to be seen as and what one truly feels. They revealed the impossible challenge of existing authentically in a life built around perception. And they revealed the danger of underestimating the emotional depth behind Harry's public boundaries. Consider this. What would you do if someone you loved, someone whose pain you had witnessed, confronted you not with anger, but with the weight of history itself? How would you respond if your instinct was to protect yourself, to strategize, to maintain control, but the moment demanded vulnerability instead? These are not rhetorical questions. They are exactly what Meghan faced, and they illuminate why her tears mattered, why they were significant, and why they continue to resonate with anyone who has ever faced the tension between public performance and private emotion. There was also a timing element that intensified the moment. Meghan had been navigating her own set of pressures. Philanthropic work, media appearances, and the constant challenge of balancing public expectations with private life. Harry's statement, direct and emotionally loaded, collided with these pressures in a way that magnified her reaction. It wasn't just the words, it was the perfect storm of context, timing, and emotional resonance. Every layer amplified the next, creating a reaction that was immediate, intense, and uncontainable. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this moment was the insight it gave into Meghan's inner world. For years, the public has speculated about her motivations, her intentions, and her emotional state. Here, behind closed doors, in this unguarded moment, the truth became clear. She was not simply reacting to criticism. She was grappling with a profound understanding of the stakes, the history, and the human cost of the life she had chosen. She was learning, in real time, what it truly meant to exist under the shadow of both love and legacy, under the scrutiny of the world, and under the weight of someone else's trauma. And yet, even as she processed all of this, Meghan's mind did not stop racing. She began questioning herself. Had she misstepped? Had she crossed a line Harry could not forgive? Could her ambitions, her media presence, or her desire to be seen and heard somehow be threatening to the very person she loved? These questions, unspoken yet loud in the private room, drove the emotional intensity even higher. They were questions that no publicist, advisor, or royal aide could answer. They were questions only she could face, and the answers were terrifyingly ambiguous. So, as Meghan wept and tried to reconcile her public persona with her private reaction, one thing became increasingly clear. The balance between love, loyalty, and media perception was precarious at best. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, carried meaning far beyond the immediate moment. And every action, no matter how small, could trigger ripples that would echo across the media, the palace, and the global audience watching every move. The tension was electric. The stakes were unimaginable, and Meghan, for the first time in a long while, felt truly powerless. Not because she lacked strength, but because the forces around her were so complex, so intertwined, that no amount of preparation or strategy could shield her. She was facing the raw human truth of living in a world where every tear, every word, and every reaction was magnified, scrutinized, and judged. And just when it seemed that the intensity of the moment had reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A decision, a gesture, a subtle reaction that would shift the balance and change the dynamics between them forever. What it was, exactly, remains the kind of detail that the public will speculate about endlessly. But suffice it to say, it was powerful enough to create a turning point, one that would resonate in private conversations, media headlines, and the narrative of their shared life. But what came next would escalate the tension beyond anything Meghan, or anyone, had anticipated. What drives a man to draw a line so clear, so unyielding, that even those he loves most hesitate to cross it? For Prince Harry, the answer is written in the chapters of a life that began in privilege but was shadowed by tragedy. It is written in the loss of a mother, in the constant glare of cameras, in the relentless scrutiny that shaped every decision he ever made. And on that day, standing before the world and the woman he loved, Harry drew a line, a boundary so sharp that it left Meghan reeling, questioning, and emotionally exposed. Harry's statement, "I lost one woman to the cameras. I won't lose myself to them again," was not delivered in anger. It was delivered in a calm, measured tone, precise and deliberate. But beneath that composure lay decades of fear, loss, and determination. Every syllable was informed by the past, the flashbulbs, the rumors, the relentless media attention that had consumed Diana's life and, ultimately, contributed to her death. Harry had carried that pain silently for years, internalizing lessons the world could never fully understand. And now, he was using his voice to protect himself, to protect Meghan, and to draw a boundary that could not be ignored. But here's the tension. Harry was not just setting a personal boundary. He was sending a message to the public, to the media, and to the world. He was signaling that some lines cannot be crossed, that certain lessons must be heeded, and that history, especially the tragic history of his mother, would not be repeated. In a sense, Harry's statement was both defensive and declarative. He was protecting himself while also warning Meghan, and perhaps the world, of the cost of ignoring the shadows of the past. Now, imagine being Meghan in that moment. You're a woman who has carefully navigated your own public narrative. You understand optics, strategy, and perception. You know how to handle criticism, how to project strength, how to control the message. Yet here, faced with a man whose life has been shaped by the most painful public scrutiny imaginable, your skills feel suddenly inadequate. You are confronted with the raw, unfiltered weight of history, grief, and love, and you realize that no amount of strategy can shield you from the emotional force of Harry's resolve. The contrast between Harry's calm authority and Meghan's emotional response is striking. It is almost cinematic in its intensity. The measured, composed man drawing a line, and the intelligent, confident woman confronting the enormity of what that line represents. And it's important to recognize that Harry's approach was not just about control. It was about survival. It was about ensuring that he did not repeat the mistakes of the past. It was about honoring Diana's memory while safeguarding the life he and Meghan were building together. This is where the emotional stakes escalate. Because when Harry speaks, it is never just words. Every statement carries the weight of lived experience. Every pause conveys a history of trauma. Every emphasis signals a boundary that cannot be crossed. And for Meghan, the realization is both terrifying and illuminating. She is not just navigating a marriage. She is navigating a man's past, a family legacy, and the shadow of a tragedy that continues to shape every decision he makes. Consider the psychology at play. Harry has lived a life under constant observation. He has learned to anticipate the motives of those around him, to read intentions, and to protect himself in subtle, strategic ways. His public declaration to Meghan was an extension of that skill, a calculated yet deeply emotional maneuver designed to protect, instruct, and warn simultaneously. It was a masterclass in setting boundaries, one that combined vulnerability with authority, personal stakes with public messaging. But the complexity doesn't end there. Harry's line was also a reflection of his unbreakable vow to Diana. The promise he made to himself, and perhaps to her memory, was never to allow history to repeat itself. Losing one woman to the cameras had been an unbearable tragedy. Losing another, whether emotionally, psychologically, or physically, was a risk he refused to take. Every word he spoke, every pause, every subtle inflection was informed by that vow. It was not merely a warning to Meghan. It was a declaration of loyalty to a memory that shaped his very being. And yet, there is irony in the situation. Harry, who has spent a lifetime avoiding the pitfalls of public scrutiny, was now married to someone whose life had been defined, in part, by public attention. Meghan had navigated fame with skill and strategy, understanding the power and pitfalls of media presence. But Harry's history, and the lessons he carried, created a friction that neither could ignore. The tension between private experience and public persona, between past trauma and present ambition, was palpable, almost unbearable. Think about it. How do you reconcile love with legacy? How do you navigate a partnership when one person's past contains trauma so profound that it dictates boundaries for the present? These are not simple questions, and Meghan's emotional response demonstrates the difficulty of such reconciliation. Her tears were not just about being confronted. They were about understanding, processing, and internalizing the gravity of Harry's experience. They were the reaction of someone suddenly realizing that their partner's past is as alive and influential as any present choice. And there's another layer, one that is often overlooked. Harry's line was as much about education as it was about protection. By drawing the boundary publicly, he was teaching Meghan something crucial, that their lives are not just personal, not just private, but part of a larger narrative shaped by history, media, and legacy. He was demonstrating that every action, every decision, and every interaction carries weight far beyond the immediate moment. And for Meghan, absorbing that lesson in real time was both enlightening and emotionally overwhelming. At the same time, Harry's approach was strategic. By setting the line publicly, he ensured that the world understood the seriousness of the moment. He signaled to the media that there were limits, that certain behaviors would not be tolerated, and that the stakes were real. This dual purpose, protecting Meghan while simultaneously warning the world, demonstrates the complexity of his character and the depth of his understanding of both human nature and media dynamics. And yet, for all his calculated approach, the emotional impact on Meghan was undeniable. She had entered a situation where strategy collided with lived trauma, where public persona met personal boundaries, and where love had to coexist with the memory of loss. The tears were inevitable. They were a natural human response to an extraordinary set of circumstances. They revealed vulnerability, depth, and understanding. They exposed the raw, unfiltered reality of navigating love and legacy under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. But the tension didn't end with the statement. It was only the beginning. The implications of Harry's line and Meghan's response to it rippled outward, affecting private conversations, public appearances, media narratives, and even internal palace dynamics. Every ally, every aide, every media strategist recognized that something had shifted. A boundary had been drawn, and the consequences of crossing it could be far-reaching. And then came the next twist, subtle yet powerful, that would change the trajectory of the day and the relationship. Meghan, processing the weight of Harry's words, began to consider her own strategy. Would she respond with restraint, with reflection, with understanding? Or would the instinct to defend herself, to assert her public persona, to push back against perceived judgment, take hold? That question, unanswered and tense, hung in the room, thick with anticipation. But what Meghan did next would escalate the tension in ways neither she nor Harry could have anticipated, setting the stage for confrontations, revelations, and a series of events that would ripple far beyond that room. What happens when private conflict erupts into the glare of global attention? When personal boundaries, emotional outbursts, and private decisions collide with a world that never blinks. For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, this was no theoretical scenario. It was reality. And the moment Harry publicly drew a line, the world responded in kind, in real time, with all the intensity, distortion, and spectacle that the media could muster. The cameras were relentless. Every angle, every facial expression, every pause was captured, scrutinized, and analyzed. The flashes of paparazzi cameras punctuated the air like gunfire, each click a small explosion, feeding a narrative larger than either Meghan or Harry. But it wasn't just the press outside the palace gates. Social media ignited in seconds. Twitter feeds erupted. Instagram stories spread like wildfire. Headlines appeared before the ink could dry, many repeating, exaggerating, or outright misrepresenting the events of that tense moment. A private confrontation between a husband and wife became global theater, and the public consumed every word, every tear, every sigh, as if it were a scripted drama. Harry had anticipated some scrutiny. He knew the consequences of speaking openly about personal boundaries, about Diana's legacy, and about media intrusion. But the speed and intensity of the reaction was staggering even by his experienced standards. Within minutes, every nuance of his statement was dissected. Pundits debated tone. Commentators speculated on motivation. Headlines sensationalized every inflection, every pause, turning what was a deeply personal warning into public fodder for ratings and clicks. Meanwhile, Meghan faced a dual challenge. On one hand, she had to process her own emotions, to reconcile tears with composure, vulnerability with public persona. On the other hand, she had to navigate a media frenzy that had already transformed a moment of intimacy into a spectacle of judgment. Every expression was analyzed, every gesture interpreted. "Why is she crying?" asked one outlet. "Is this defiance or despair?" asked another. The questions were endless, the assumptions unrelenting. And beneath it all, Meghan had to maintain some semblance of dignity while the world watched her every move. And it wasn't just traditional media that applied pressure. The palace itself was a silent observer, with aides, advisors, and family members weighing in behind closed doors. Leaks began to emerge, carefully curated and strategically timed, sending subtle messages to both Meghan and the world. Allies whispered guidance. Critics issued veiled warnings. Every conversation, no matter how private, seemed to carry the weight of scrutiny and consequence. Meghan realized, perhaps for the first time in a concentrated moment, that there was no fully private space left. Even walls, closed doors, and trusted confidants were permeable under the pressure of this intricate web of attention and influence. This pressure was psychological as much as it was practical. Imagine being constantly measured against both public expectation and private precedent. Imagine knowing that any mistake, or perceived mistake, could reverberate across headlines, social feeds, and family discussions for weeks, months, or even years. For Meghan, the awareness of this scrutiny heightened the emotional intensity of her tears, the weight of Harry's warning, and the sense of urgency to reconcile strategy with reality. And yet, the irony was sharp. Meghan had spent years understanding media strategy, mastering the art of narrative control and navigating attention with precision. She had built a life in which optics mattered. And now, faced with Harry's boundary and the overwhelming media storm, she realized that strategy alone could not protect her. The personal, the historical, and the emotional had collided with the public, and no amount of skill or foresight could fully manage the consequences. At the same time, the story the media told was inherently contradictory. Some outlets painted Harry as domineering, cold, or controlling. Others depicted Meghan as fragile, emotional, or reckless. Few captured the nuance of trauma, grief, or legacy, the invisible forces that shaped every word, every reaction, and every decision. The truth was more complex than headlines allowed. Harry's statement was a protective measure, Meghan's tears a human response, and the public's consumption a reflection of society's hunger for spectacle. Yet the tension created by this triangle, private emotion, public statement, global scrutiny, was almost unbearable. Now, imagine the internal pressure building within the palace itself. Advisors, aides, and family members observed every move with strategic precision. Some offered counsel, warning of public backlash. Others monitored media interpretations, weighing potential impact on royal reputation and legacy. And yet, the most critical observations came from Harry and Meghan themselves. They had to interpret not only each other's words and emotions, but also the expectations, fears, and pressures imposed by centuries of tradition, protocol, and public scrutiny. It was a psychological tightrope walk, one misstep away from scandal, misrepresentation, or crisis. And the media's reaction was not merely passive. It actively shaped behavior. Headlines framed Meghan's tears as defiance, vulnerability, or manipulation, depending on the outlet. Social media fueled speculation, amplifying both praise and criticism. Each tweet, post, or article created feedback loops that Meghan and Harry could neither control nor escape. And within this feedback loop, the intensity of emotion escalated. Private conflict became a public performance, and every micro-expression became evidence. Every pause became a story. This environment created an almost surreal contradiction. Meghan, who had cultivated poise and strategy in public life, found that her ability to navigate perception was simultaneously a strength and a limitation. Her skill in understanding optics allowed her to anticipate some consequences, but it could not shield her from the raw impact of Harry's words, nor could it contain the ripple effects of global scrutiny. Every step she took, every gesture she made, was magnified, interpreted, and debated in ways that made the private intensity of the moment feel infinite. And the psychological stakes went deeper still. Harry's statement and Meghan's tears were catalysts, but the pressure from media and palace scrutiny amplified the emotional stakes exponentially. Imagine feeling that not only must you navigate your partner's emotional boundaries, but also the eyes of millions, the interpretations of thousands of advisors, and the subtle expectations of centuries-old institutions. This is a pressure unlike any other, and it illuminated the fragility of human composure under extraordinary conditions. Yet, even under this crushing pressure, Meghan and Harry were not simply pawns of circumstance. They were actors in a complex narrative of their own making, negotiating personal boundaries, emotional vulnerability, and the weight of historical legacy. Every choice, every reaction, every glance became a statement in itself. Every tear Meghan shed was both a human response and a narrative device. Every word Harry spoke was a boundary, a lesson, and a declaration. And every observation from the public, media, and palace added layers of tension and uncertainty that neither could escape. But here's the twist few people saw. In the midst of this media storm and palace pressure, an unexpected moment of clarity emerged. A subtle shift in Meghan's perception, a fleeting understanding of Harry's unyielding resolve, and a recognition that the stakes were far larger than personal pride or ambition. She began to see, in real time, the intersection of love, trauma, and legacy, not as abstract concepts, but as forces shaping every word and every tear. This was a revelation that would influence every interaction, every decision, and every public appearance in the days and weeks that followed. And yet, as the storm intensified, the consequences of the media frenzy were only beginning to emerge. Every leak, every article, every social post carried implications not just for public perception, but for private trust. Allies began to question strategy. Advisors pushed for careful messaging, and the weight of expectation threatened to fracture even the most stable foundations. What Meghan and Harry would do next, and how they would navigate the intersecting pressures of emotion, history, and global attention, was anyone's guess. But what happened next would escalate the stakes in ways no one could have anticipated, creating a private storm behind closed doors that mirrored the chaos outside, and forcing decisions that would reverberate far beyond that tense, unforgettable moment. Was Meghan truly orchestrating a strategy, or was she simply reacting to the overwhelming pressure surrounding her? That question has haunted observers, insiders, and royal commentators alike. On the surface, Meghan Markle had always been savvy with the media, every appearance carefully timed, every statement measured, every gesture intentional. But in the aftermath of Harry's public declaration, the line between intentional PR maneuver and human vulnerability became almost impossible to distinguish. To understand the stakes, consider Meghan's position. She was a woman thrust into a world she didn't fully control, yet one she had learned to navigate with sophistication. Before Harry, she built a career on visibility, on crafting narratives that aligned with her ambitions and values. She knew the power of optics, the influence of social perception, and the subtle art of storytelling through appearance and demeanor. Every interview, every photo shoot, every public engagement was an exercise in influence. She understood how to capture attention and shape the narrative. And yet, when confronted with Harry's harsh boundary, the strategies that had once been so effective suddenly felt inadequate. Suddenly, her decisions weren't just about controlling perception. They were about reconciling private emotion with public expectation. Every tear she shed, every word she considered speaking, every glance exchanged with Harry became layered with meaning. Was she expressing genuine emotion, or was she calculating the next move? Was she defending herself, or managing a public impression? Could both exist simultaneously? These questions created tension not only for Meghan, but for everyone watching. There were those in her inner circle who believed that Meghan's actions were intentional, that she understood the stakes, and was leveraging every opportunity for maximum narrative impact. Some argued that her calculated engagement with the media, carefully crafted photos, controlled statements, and even subtle gestures, was a form of strategic PR designed to assert influence and maintain relevance in a world obsessed with image. But even those supporters could not fully account for the emotional undercurrent driving her responses. Because intention alone does not explain the tears, the moments of hesitation, and the profound impact of Harry's words. At the same time, critics painted Meghan in a very different light. To them, the tears and public gestures were proof of manipulation, a carefully constructed performance meant to dominate headlines, capture sympathy, and assert influence. They suggested that every sigh, every pause, every glance was strategically designed to send a message to Harry, to the media, and to the world at large. But reality, as it often does, was more nuanced. The truth exists in the intersection of intentionality and emotion, where strategy and vulnerability collide in ways that are difficult to parse even for insiders. To understand this, you have to see the complexity of the situation. Meghan was not just navigating her own media presence. She was navigating the legacy of Diana, the expectations of Harry, and the relentless scrutiny of the public. Every move carried historical weight. Every choice had the potential to influence public perception, familial relationships, and personal trust. And within this web, the boundary Harry drew became both a challenge and a guide, a marker indicating which strategies were viable and which could trigger unintended consequences. And then there's the irony. Meghan, trained in the art of managing public attention, found herself constrained by the very person whose past had been destroyed by that attention. Harry's experiences, his boundaries, and his trauma dictated the terms of engagement, creating a situation where Meghan's instincts to influence or control the narrative collided with his unyielding need for protection. This tension fueled the drama, and it's what made every decision, every gesture, and every reaction so critical. Now, some insiders claim that Meghan's attempts to manage perception were not malicious or manipulative. They were instinctive. When the cameras were present, when headlines were imminent, she reverted to the behaviors that had served her in the past. This included subtle gestures, timing of appearances, and selective disclosures. But the key difference in this situation was Harry. His boundaries, informed by trauma and loss, created an emotional friction that made even routine strategies risky. What might have worked before now threatened to ignite conflict, both private and public. The tension escalated as Meghan realized that media strategy could no longer function independently of emotion. Every decision now had personal consequences. Every attempt to control perception risked conflict with Harry's boundaries. and every emotional reaction risked amplification by a public eager to consume, critique, and judge. The stakes were higher than ever, and Meghan's PR instincts suddenly felt like a double-edged sword. Some observers suggest that Meghan may have underestimated the psychological and emotional weight of Harry's warning. Perhaps she believed that her media experience gave her leverage, a form of control that could navigate even the most delicate situations. But Harry's history was a force unlike any other, a combination of grief, experience, and protective instinct that left little room for error. The intersection of Meghan's PR instincts and Harry's trauma created a volatile mix, where even the most carefully considered move could trigger emotional consequences far beyond what either expected. And yet, in the midst of this tension, Meghan displayed remarkable resilience. She processed the feedback, calculated the risks, and began considering next steps, even as the world watched. She balanced vulnerability with strategy, emotion with calculation, and personal desire with public expectation. The public may have seen tears and gestures, but beneath the surface, Meghan was navigating a labyrinth of decisions, each with high stakes and profound consequences. The contradictions in her behavior were striking. On one hand, there was raw emotion, tears, hesitation, and moments of vulnerability that revealed the human impact of Harry's statement. On the other hand, there was strategic intent, careful positioning, subtle messaging, and an acute awareness of the optics at play. The interplay between these forces created a complex, dynamic narrative that fascinated both supporters and critics, and that would continue to unfold over the coming weeks and months. And here's where the tension sharpens even further. Harry, observing Meghan's reactions, had to interpret not only her words and gestures, but her intentions. Was she acting strategically, reacting emotionally, or both simultaneously? The ambiguity created a charged atmosphere, one where trust, perception, and legacy intersected in unpredictable ways. Every interaction became a test, every statement a potential catalyst for conflict, and every emotional reaction a signal to be interpreted. As the media frenzy continued, Meghan's team worked tirelessly to manage the narrative, crafting statements and appearances that would balance transparency, image, and emotional resonance. Yet no strategy could fully contain the ripple effects of Harry's words. Every article, tweet, and social post amplified the tension, creating a feedback loop that magnified both emotional and strategic stakes. Meghan's attempts to assert control were constantly countered by the historical, emotional, and public forces surrounding her. The situation was a crucible, testing Meghan's ability to navigate personal relationships, media attention, and legacy simultaneously. Every decision carried weight. Every gesture was scrutinized. And as Meghan balanced strategy with vulnerability, she came to a realization that would shape her future actions. Control in public life is fragile when private emotion is raw, and no amount of PR expertise can fully mitigate the human response to trauma, history, and unyielding boundaries. But just when it seemed Meghan might regain some sense of equilibrium, the next challenge arrived. An unforeseen reaction from Harry, subtle yet decisive, that would escalate tension and force a confrontation neither had anticipated. Have you ever had a moment where everything you thought you knew about a relationship shifted in seconds? Where a single word, gesture, or look peeled back the surface and revealed a raw, emotional truth you couldn't ignore? That was exactly what happened behind closed doors between Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. A private confrontation so intense, so emotionally charged, that it would leave both of them forever altered. The tension had been simmering for days. Public statements, private glances, media speculation, and historical baggage had created a pressure cooker. Meghan, still processing the weight of Harry's public boundary, felt the dual pull of strategy and emotion. Harry, steadfast and determined, had made it clear that certain lines could not be crossed, and that the lessons of Diana's life were not negotiable. But when the door closed and the cameras retreated, the stakes became intensely personal. The room became a crucible, a place where raw truth collided with love, ambition, and fear. The confrontation began subtly. Meghan tried to navigate the discussion with diplomacy, carefully choosing words that would convey understanding without appearing defensive. But Harry's patience was thin, honed by decades of experiences that demanded vigilance and clarity. His calm, controlled demeanor was almost cinematic, each word deliberate, each pause measured, but the underlying intensity was palpable. Every sentence he spoke carried the weight of loss, warning, and expectation. "Do you understand why I said it?" Harry asked, his tone even but unyielding. The question was simple, yet its impact was immense. It wasn't merely about comprehension, it was a test. A measure of whether Meghan grasped the emotional, historical, and personal significance of his declaration. It was also a line drawn in the sand, signaling that emotional missteps could have consequences beyond what Meghan could imagine. Meghan's response was layered. She expressed understanding, yet her words also revealed frustration, fear, and uncertainty. The conversation quickly escalated, not into shouting or anger, but into a tension so intense that silence itself felt dangerous. Each pause, each sigh, each glance became a battleground. She had learned to manage public perception, to project composure in the most scrutinized environments. But here, in the private arena of raw emotion, there was no script. There was no pre-written answer that could satisfy both history and the present moment. Harry, sensing her ambivalence, pushed further. He needed to ensure that the boundary was not only heard but internalized. "I can't go through what my mother went through," he said, voice steady but firm. "I can't let the media control our lives. I won't lose another person I love to their intrusion." The statement wasn't accusatory, it was declarative, a manifestation of trauma and love intertwined. It was meant to convey urgency, and it did. Meghan could feel it in her chest, in her stomach, in the tension tightening around her every thought. And yet, Meghan didn't retreat. Instead, she pushed back, gently, carefully, questioning not Harry, but the broader implications. "I understand the pain," she said, "but sometimes we can't hide. Sometimes visibility is power. Sometimes we need to be seen to make change." Her words were measured, strategic, but they carried an emotional weight that spoke to her own experiences, her own ambitions, and her own understanding of the media. She wasn't challenging Harry personally. She was challenging the tension between privacy and purpose, between personal safety and public influence. The clash was subtle, but explosive. Two very different perspectives, shaped by trauma, experience, and history, collided in a confined space. Harry's fear, born from loss and decades of public scrutiny, met Meghan's confidence, born from visibility and strategic awareness. Neither was wrong, yet neither could fully bridge the emotional divide. The result was a charged, almost electric tension that neither had experienced in the same way before. And then came a revelation, a moment of unfiltered honesty that escalated the confrontation to a new level. Meghan admitted, softly but firmly, that she sometimes felt constrained, misunderstood, and even mischaracterized by the very media Harry feared. Her words revealed not just frustration, but a deep desire to balance autonomy with partnership. She wasn't asking for permission. She was articulating a truth she had felt for months, perhaps years. Harry heard her, but his response was immediate and unambiguous. Boundaries had to hold. The stakes were too high, the past too vivid, and the consequences too real. This confrontation revealed a paradox at the heart of their relationship. Love and protection, vulnerability and authority, ambition and caution. They were constantly intertwined, often in contradictory ways. Each wanted the other to understand, yet the lens through which each viewed the situation was fundamentally different. Harry saw history, trauma, and risk. Meghan saw opportunity, influence, and purpose. And in that tension, the room felt both intimate and explosive. The emotional beats were staggering. Tears flowed, not just from Meghan, but subtly from Harry as well, though his were quieter, controlled, almost hidden behind the calm exterior. The room was heavy with unspoken understanding, grief, fear, and love. The walls themselves seemed to absorb the weight, as if even the physical space recognized the intensity of the moment. Every gesture, every glance, every word was amplified in meaning. Every silence was a question, every pause a potential fracture. And then came the turning point. Meghan, feeling both the weight of Harry's trauma and the scrutiny of her own ambitions, made a decision. a subtle yet profound action that would escalate the stakes further. It was a decision that neither aides, nor publicists, nor media analysts could fully anticipate. It was a decision born of emotion, strategy, and necessity, and it set the stage for a series of consequences that would ripple far beyond that room. Here's the twist. The confrontation did not resolve neatly. It didn't end with clarity, reconciliation, or